Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. And today my guest is a good old friend of mine, Eli Groner. Eli has been in many different roles in the Israeli government. Before that, he worked for McKinsey, was a consultant. He then was Israel's economic attaché to Washington, where I had the privilege of actually having dinner in his house a number of years ago, back in, was it 2013 or 2014?
What happened in Silver Spring stays in Silver Spring.
Exactly. I'm not talking about it. And then Eli returned to Israel and eventually was appointed the Director General of the Prime Minister's Office, which is basically the highest level of a civil servant in the Israeli government and a professional employee of the Israeli government, basically oversees as the Director General. And Eli, you'll tell us a bit about it, of what it means to really coordinate between all of the different government industries on all of the big issues that have to do with definitely civil society, but also the defense establishment and the defense budget and the state budget, and you name it, across all sectors of Israel. Eli has experience in the tech sector, in investment, and you name it. Eli's been there. And beyond just being a smart person with a lot of great experience, the reason that I wanted to talk to you was because, to me, it seems that everything's a bit messed up today in Israel. And I say that with just a bit. And I say that with some sadness, but also when we look at what's going on, and you and I have been talking a bit about this, one day we have a head of, let's take the head of Shabak, for example. Let's start with him. So Ronen Bar fails on October 7th the most miserable way. Fights, brings back some, is able to repair to some extent his name and reputation with some success, but at the end of the day is the guy who failed on October 7th. The prime minister says, I've lost trust and faith in this guy, decides he wants to remove him from his position, wants to appoint someone else. I mean, how did we get to a point that this is now in the high court? You have the attorney general who's outlining a whole new system that never existed before for how to remove a head of Shabak and how to install a new head of Shabak. The prime minister can't even delegate the authority to another one of his ministers because they don't trust them either. I mean, the whole thing, not to mention the fact that the attorney general they also want to remove. But I mean, tell me, why is this all happening?
That's such a broad question. I'll just say that for reasons both legitimate and illegitimate, there is very, very significant judicial overreach. And again, I'm emphasizing legitimate and illegitimate. And virtually every important political decision ends up in the courts. And you're asked, why is courts dealing with whether the prime minister can hire or fire the head of the Shabak? Why are the courts dealing with whether he can hire and fire the equivalent of the attorney general? Because they can. Because there's no oversight on the courts that says this has legal standing, this doesn't have legal standing. It's a very, very, very complicated issue. But for better and for worse, the courts are very, very involved in the relationship between the executive branch and Israeli citizens.
Now, just explain for our listeners, the Attorney General in Israel is not like the Attorney General in the United States, right? The Attorney General of the United States, now Pam Bondi, serves at the pleasure of the President of the United States. And if the President of the United States says, I don't want this person anymore to be my Attorney General, she's out of a job, right? Here in Israel, it's very different. Even though this Gali Bahar of Miara, she wasn't appointed by the Netanyahu government, she was appointed by the Bennett Lapid government. But even Netanyahu doesn't get to have an attorney general who is his appointment.
So for your listeners, I think it's important to understand a very, very significant difference between the way things operate here in Israel versus in the U.S. Unlike in the U.S., where the president appoints his own attorney general and legal advisors, in Israel, the attorney general is a permanent, unelected official who holds enormous power over what the government can and can't do, and sometimes overrides the elected leadership. Now, the current example you're describing is the prime minister is not allowed to appoint the head of the Internal Security Service, the Shabak, because the attorney general has determined that he is personally, Prime Minister Netanyahu is personally too conflicted to make that decision. Now, on top of that,
because of the so-called Qatargate investigation,
yes, the investigations into Qatargate and to his staff, therefore he's conflicted, therefore he can't hire.
By the way, he's not a suspect. It's people who worked for him who are suspected of something, which we don't even really know what they're suspected of.
But basically the decision, think about it, that the prime minister can't appoint the head of the Shabak because of his personal conflict. And on top of that, the prime minister can't even remove the attorney general who made that ruling. Now, imagine, your listeners should imagine, if an unelected U.S. attorney general could tell the president they can't nominate the head of the FBI or the head of the CIA, and that the president also had no legal way to replace that attorney general, most Americans would find that an imbalance of power, right? An imbalance of power. And this is exactly why many Israelis, including myself, believe that judicial reform here is needed. Now, do the courts and legal advisors need to be independent? Absolutely. Of course. But they can't be unaccountable. They can't have no democratic oversight. The current situation goes beyond checks and balances and creates paralysis, which is unhealthy for any democracy. And that's how we end up in a situation where the prime minister can't appoint the head of the Shabak, the prime minister, every sort of important decision that the executive branch wants to make, the courts end up deciding.
What will happen, Eli, just from kind of, I'm asking you to guess, but if Netanyahu goes ahead, Ronen Bars has said that on June 15th, I think it is, he's going to be stepping down. Netanyahu has tapped former IDF General David Zini to be the new head of the Shabak. What happens if Netanyahu brings the appointment to the cabinet votes on it, the ministers vote, they approve the appointment? How does it play out? Because that's like a bit of a game of chicken right there, right? Netanyahu is saying, I'm going ahead even despite you, Attorney General, telling me I can't do it.
It's interesting because there's workarounds for this, right? So David Zini is exemplary and he passes the bar for sort of criteria that there's this committee that sort of checks the values and integrity, and any general in the army is going to pass that sort of threshold. So by credentials, he's certainly sufficiently credentialed. Now, the issue is Netanyahu has a personal conflict. Therefore, it's a procedural question. It's not a substantive question.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if it's a procedural question, there are ways around it, right? Netanyahu can not make the official nomination. He can delegate the decision to the defense minister, for example, Israel Katz, and let him make the nomination, and then it would probably go through. It seems like Netanyahu is prioritizing this sort of clash of who actually decides here. Is it the courts? Is it the attorney general? Is it the legal advisor? Or is it the executive, the elected officials? And that, it seems like, is more important than actually making sure that Zini is officially the head of the Shabak. It's a very, very, very interesting dynamic that's playing out here, and who knows how it's going to end. I do think that if it falls, it'll fall on procedural issues and not on substantive issues.
And David Zini might be left with neither his job in the IDF, which he had to step down from, or becoming the head of the Shabak.
That's a personal question for David Zini. I mean,
he's collateral damage in the bigger battle.
This is a much bigger issue than, David Zini is, as wonderful a person as he is.
I mean, when judicial reform, let's step back for a moment. When judicial reform was first unveiled or rolled out back in January of 2023, 10 months before October 7th by the Justice Minister Yariv Levin, a lot of it made sense to a lot of Israelis, right? There was a need for more transparency. There was a need for more accountability by the courts, by the attorney generals. There should have been how judges are appointed, right? We have this crazy system, this committee of 9, where judges are appointing judges, right? Nowhere else do you have a situation like crazy. No one knows what goes on in those committees. That's transparency. No one knows what the conversations are and why this judge and not that judge. But there was also the issue of the override bill, right? So if the Knesset passes law, the court strikes it down. Can the Knesset re-legislate that law with a larger number of legislators to be able to get it through? And of course, the legal advisors all made sense, right? All was for a country, by the way.
Well, I would say that the override clause did not make sense. Okay. I don't want to get too far into the weeds here yet.
But that what made sense with that there's a need. 75 years as a country, we need some sort of overhaul here, reform, because we don't have a constitution, right? Which is kind of at the foundation of our big problems.
Correct.
We don't have clear delineation of what this branch does, and how they all are supposed to work together. So it failed because of how it was shoved and pushed through in a very aggressive way. And then, of course, October 7th came along and that went out the window for the time being. But it seems that they're trying to bring it back. I mean, so where do you see the value in judicial reform? And how can it be done in a way that really is not about that clash you spoke about before? That's for politics, is more for the substance of what's good for you and I as citizens.
So, Yaakov, I'd like to take a step back, if I may. And one thing that often gets missed in the debate about judicial reform in Israel is that the imbalance is not just about the courts. It's about the entire structure of Israeli governance, the branches that you were referring to, right? Israel today has a system where both the executive branch and the judiciary are very strong, while the legislative branch is very weak. We have no formal separation between the executive branch and the legislature, right? The government effectively controls the Knesset, and as a result, the legislature lacks the independence and institutional capacity to serve as an effective check on the executive branch. And what happens is, that's the structural imbalance that we really need to be addressing. And that's what makes the judicial reform so complicated when you look at it in isolation. So if you look at the judicial reform in isolation, I think, which is what everyone was doing, we're all missing the bigger picture. Yes, there are real challenges or real questions about the scope of judicial power. No question. But the deeper challenge is, how do you create a healthier balance of power across all branches of government? And reforming the courts is one piece of that. But we also need to think about strengthening the role of the legislator and improving executive accountability. That's critical.
How can we do that?
So we need to give...
Because let's just explain for one moment. We vote in this country, parliamentary system, so I vote for a party. The parties together then make a coalition. The coalition effectively derives from it the executive branch.
Yeah.
So the prime minister controls the executive branch, and he controls the majority in the Knesset.
Think about it from an American perspective. Think about it this way: the president is elected, and when he's putting together his cabinet, his government, he basically looks at the entire United States and says, "Okay, there's 350 million people here. Who do I want to be my Secretary of the Treasury? Who do I want to be my Secretary of Transportation? Who do I want my Secretary of Homeland Security, et cetera, et cetera?" And that's the way he fills out his 15-person cabinet. In Israel, you have elections, and all of a sudden, the senior cabinet roles, the ministers, are given to the people that were running for the legislature.
Right.
So the prime minister is stuck in a situation where he doesn't get to look at the entire 10 million people and say, "I want Yaakov Katz to be my Secretary of Education."
Wouldn't happen, but okay.
But I want, so-and-so,
Right.
the most qualified person to be Secretary of Health. What he has to look at is, who are the senior people in his party? Who are the people in the members?
And that's how you get the most unqualified people in these jobs.
Oh, without question.
Right.
But you're taking basically people, think about this for a second. You're taking people that you were running against. Up until the day of the election, you were saying, "Don't vote for that guy, he's a crook, vote for me, I'm better." All of a sudden, you're bringing them into the coalition, and this is becoming your minister. Or even worse, it's enemies within your own party, right? That's worse than enemies from the other.
I don't want to interrupt you, guys. Just, I worked for, I worked for Naftali Bennett for a couple of years. When he first got into government, he was Minister of Economy, Minister of Diaspora Affairs, and that was from 2013. I worked with him through 2015. There was an election in 2015. And it was an ugly, ugly election. That was where they came up with this idea, Yeri B'toch Hagmash, like shooting within the armored personnel carrier, like the right wing attacking one another. And it was really ugly between Bennett and Netanyahu. And I remember the election ends, and they start the coalition talks and announcements made. He's going into his government. I said to Naftali one day, I really don't, like, maybe I'm thin-skinned, I'm too sensitive as a person. You guys hate each other, right? And then suddenly you're sitting together and your partners and everything's going to be okay. I just don't understand how it works. And he looked at me and said, "Yaakov, that's politics. It's politics. It doesn't mean anything."
That's politics. And by the way, that's a situation where between Netanyahu and Bennett, there is both would grudgingly admit it, but there is mutual respect. I'll give you another example, which is even crazier from that election in 2015. So as you know, I was selected by Netanyahu to be Director General in 2015 after that election. Because the coalition negotiations are so complicated, up until like an hour before the cabinet is announced, Netanyahu did not know who his Minister for Environmental Affairs was going to be. In that particular coalition negotiation, the head of a very important party, which has since disappeared, Kulanu, Moshe Kachlon, he had secured 3 ministers, and he decided, because he was very focused on the cost of living and regarding cost of housing units, he wanted to take finance ministry for himself, construction ministry for Yoav Gallant. Yes, not that distant past. Gallant was a member of who opposed to Netanyahu, and a third one for Minister of Environmental Affairs. And he decided an hour before who that Minister of Environmental Affairs was going to be, and ended up being a gentleman named Avi Gabay. And so literally Netanyahu gets a call an hour before the ceremonial picture at the president's house that Avi Gabay is going to be your Minister for Environmental Affairs. Now, I have nothing against Avi Gabay. Actually, we got along very well. But he was fundamentally opposed to the single most important piece of policy work that we did in that government, which was developing the national gas framework, which led to the Abraham Accords. And, there was no single lever you could pull that had more of an impact, both security-wise, diplomatically, and economically. Avi Gabay was opposed. Now, can you imagine in the United States, the president has the single most important piece of policy and imposed on him as a cabinet member who's opposed to it? That's the crazy complication that we have in our coalition politics, and that's really...
So I get back to the question. So how would you change it? What would you do? So the legislative branch, the executive branch.
There's the ideal, and then there's what's practical. But here's what I would do on a practical level. Between 2015 and 2018, we had actual work plans with very, very specific targets, sort of like quantifiable goals for every ministry they had to do. It was a process. It wasn't that easy the first year, but by the end, we had a well-oiled machine where the Minister of Education had its number one goal for the year, its top 6 goal. They had work plans. What I would do is I would structure the Knesset so that instead of all these bizarre committees, some of them are effective, some of them are pointless, you would have a committee that's aligned against each ministry. In the executive branch, I would cut the number of ministries from 37 to 16. And then you have the 16 committees in the Knesset that effectively oversee the
but directly correlated,
and based on the work plans that they announced. Meaning, if, for example, the Ministry of Transportation says our top goal for the year is we want to get this road built, and our second goal is we want to do that, and our third goal is this, and if the Ministry of Internal Security says our number one goal is that we want to reduce crime by X and X percent, then there's a committee that oversees that, right? And you need to give the tools that the Knesset has for this sort of legislative oversight are the actual work plans that the executive branch has committed to. Pass legislation that forces the executive branch to do these work plans the way that we did them in my period, 2015, 2018, and then giving the legislative branch tools to do that. Once you do that, you begin going in the right direction. And then, by the way, when you've weakened the executive branch and strengthened the legislative branch, you can actually go about with the judicial reform that I think most reasonable people agree is critical, but in a way that doesn't disrupt the balance between the executive and the legislative and the judicial.
I want to ask you a question. I mean, less technical, but kind of more just trying to get into the minds of some of these people in this country. It looks like there's very much 2 camps in Israel today, right? There's the yes Bibi camp, the no Bibi camp. In the no Bibi camp, everything is looked at through the prism of is it good for Bibi? Is it bad for Bibi? Is it Bibi? Is it not Bibi? And by the way, so is the yes Bibi camp to some extent. I mean, you're one of the few people who has some nuance. Once can be critical, can praise, can say something good, can say something bad. Not many people can do that. But when I look at the conversation about like the attorney general as an example, I have people who say to me, no, she has to protect us. What do you mean? It's like, what does that mean she has to protect us? We have a government that we elected. I don't like this government. I didn't vote for this government. I think Itamar Ben-Gvir is a terrible minister. I have problems with a lot of the ministers in this government. But at the end, they were chosen by the people of Israel, whether we like it or we don't. And with that choice, when they are elected democratically, they have the authority to make decisions that we might not like. Someone said to me about David Zini as an example, right? David Zini, he's going to protect Bibi. He's going to be loyal to Bibi, not to the Shabak, blah, blah. But let's even say that's true, and I don't think it's true, right?
You shouldn't even get that lip.
No, but I don't even think it's true because the guy gave 35 years to his life to service in the IDF. First and foremost is the state. But let's even say one second.
For the record, that's a despicable opinion that should not even be given.
Okay, but you're hearing that opinion anyhow. Of course. But let's even say for a second, Ellie, that maybe it's partially true. 1 second. Bibi's the prime minister. He was elected. Why would he not be able to appoint someone who he wants to appoint? I don't understand this thinking. Like, why are we so divided on something that should be pretty straightforward?
So you're taking a very sort of mature democratic view. I want to give the other side just for the sake of argument so that, because you're right. Of course, there needs to be an alignment between responsibility and authority, right? You can't elect people and then have the decision-making left to career bureaucrats in the courts. The flip side, the other side of that argument is as follows. And this is really the conundrum in a nutshell. Let's say we agree that the executive branch, that the elected officials should have the rights to determine policy, right? People elected them, they represent the people. We see too often decisions made by the executive branch that are so fundamentally unfair and so broadly panned that people, for example, blanket exemptions to tens of thousands of people from serving in the military.
The ultra-Orthodox.
Right. Just because whatever. And they have their reasons, and I don't want to be dismissive of that, but I think most reasonable people can agree that that's fundamentally unfair. Just a fundamentally unfair thing to do. They don't have to serve, and your friends and other people's friends have to not only do 3 years, but then do hundreds of days of reserve duty a year.
How many of your kids are serving right now, Ellie?
It's not. I have 4 kids in the Army right now.
4 kids.
But by the way, the ones doing reserve duty right now, it's even a bigger challenge, right? I have 2. Being an officer is one thing; it's sort of a path you've chosen. But people are being disrupted from their lives and serving 100, 200, 300 days a year for 2 years now of reserve duty, and the other people get just a blanket exemption. Now, that's so fundamentally unfair that people are turning to the courts.
Right.
So it's important to understand both sides. Now, I think most reasonable people can agree that these sort of real policy decisions should be determined by the people via their proxy, which is the elected officials. But the appeal to the courts, in part, stems because too many of these decisions are just fundamentally unfair. Now, I don't want to overstate that because a lot of it is just the left sort of clinging to the last bastion and a very politicized judiciary. But that's sort of the infamy stopper, right? That's sort of the contention for them. But you're right. This is the judicial reform. The biggest problem with it was the people that led it. They're not trustworthy, and whether they are, they aren't. The people don't trust them anymore. And if you believe in democracy, if you genuinely believe in democracy, then you should believe in both judicial independence, but you should also believe in proper limits on all branches of government, including the judiciary. And that's not a partisan view. It shouldn't be a partisan view. That's a democratic view.
What will happen? I mean, we're talking, and there might be an election being called maybe at the end of the week, although I'm a little skeptical that it's going to happen so quickly. It'll take a little longer, but I could be wrong. But election's coming, no matter what. Anyhow, it's supposed to be at the end of 26. So it'll probably be earlier in 26. What happens if Netanyahu wins again? Like, all these people who refuse to accept his rule, right? And I come from a place where I've been very critical of him over the years, but I also accept that he's elected, right? So I might not like the guy, and I might think he makes the wrong decisions, but if he's the prime minister, he gets to make the decisions. Like, I understand how the game is played.
Correct.
But what happens to all those people who are disenchanted, who are totally against him, if he does get elected again? And that's a real possibility.
I think it's the most likely, at this point, it's the most likely scenario.
Where will they be? Where will they fall?
It's a very good question. It's one that I'm sort of scared to answer, right? Because my best guess, there's a lot of people in this sort of the just not Bibi camp, right? Who really are holding out hope that when the next election comes, he won't be reelected.
Right.
I don't know how likely that is, but they believe it's highly likely, right? When you sit in an echo chamber and you convince yourselves and you believe the polls that are shown on sort of mainstream Israeli television channels, it's easy to believe that Netanyahu won't be elected again. If he does get elected, I think there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be very borderline depressed, and I think you're going to see. I'm not advocating for this, obviously, and I don't include myself in that camp. But I think a lot of people are going to get frustrated and think about leaving the country. Right? I think it's a real. I think there's a real flight risk. Now, again, I'm not advocating for that. I think it's wrong. I think people here should learn more about democracy. And by the way, because Israeli public has shifted to the right, I would love to see a genuine sort of right-wing challenge to Netanyahu, and I'd love to see sort of that emerge. Right? I think the Israeli public has never been more sort of unified in that the people are basically the way normal people describe right of center regarding defense issues, etc. I think most of the Israelis are there, but people are very, very frustrated.
And by the way, people also forget, and I forgot this at one point, that when after the Yom Kippur War, there was an election, right? Greatest disaster, bloodiest debacle, Israel taken by surprise, 2,300 soldiers plus killed. Golda Meir was reelected. I mean, people, she was the prime minister who oversaw the
real revolution wasn't until 1977.
Correct.
Listen,
so it's not unimaginable that the guy who failed comes back into office.
Oh yeah. In this situation, I think it's the highest likelihood just looking at what I'm seeing in the polls. However, what happens in the next election, grand scheme of things, is less important to me. What really matters for the Jewish people is sort of what direction are we going in here? Like, where will society be 5 years from now? Where will Israeli society be 10 years from now? Election is an event that happens every couple of years in Israel. This time, it's actually looks like this is the government that's going to be closest to filling out its term in decades,
mm-hmm.
right? But eventually, to your point, the revolution came in 1977. It didn't happen in 1974, but it happened in 1977. And we are seeing a movement here that gives me cause for optimism.
What is that movement?
I think Israelis have a better understanding of who our enemies are. I think the majority of Israelis are interested in advancing the country and believe that the state is more important, the country, the society is more important than any individuals. I've seen great desire from sort of people in civil society to actually make a difference, much more volunteer. What we're seeing from people doing the reserve duty is unthinkable in any country other than Israel, right? For a year and a half, you walk into my community synagogue, you don't see many men there between the age of 20 and 40, right? Unless they happen to be on leave, right? People are really answering the call to serve. Many people, more than was expected. I'll give one sort of anecdote, which I think is representative also of a positive change I'm seeing in the legislature. So there was there was a legislation, I don't know if I'm sure you're familiar actually, of the sort of to disengage, for Israel to disengage from the UN,
mm-hmm.
right? From the UN, sort of the UNRWA was a, terrorist organization supporting Hamas, and there was a decision to disengage from them. Now, the army was opposed.
Right.
The government was opposed. Now, typically in the Israeli Knesset, people vote based on what the executive branch tells them to do. And people vote based on what the narrow interests are of their political party, not necessarily the greater good. You saw in this vote, there were 10, the Arab parties voted against it. And then the entire coalition and opposition, every party, right? Likud members who are not in the government, Lieberman, Lapid, Gantz, they all voted in favor of this legislation. So coalition opposition, and the government abstained. Some people in the government thought it was a great move. Smotrich, they sort of voted along with Lapid and Gantz and Likud. But Netanyahu, the defense minister, the leadership of the executive branch, they abstained because they were scared. But for the first time ever, you saw
the challenge.
Wow, the legislative branch is actually acting like a legislative branch that imposes its will on the government. And why did they do it? Because these are the same people that are cowards 99% of the time. They did it because they felt that public sentiment was so great and were so fed up that even though the military was opposed, because the military is also opposed to sort of taking control over the humanitarian aid. They wanted to keep giving it to Hamas, and the government wanted to keep giving it to Hamas, but they were overwhelmed by the people.
No, I think you're 100% right. And by the way, I think that it also might be a result of October 7th, because we were so caught in that concepcia and that believing in that fairy tale that we believed that what we were told is what's going to be, and we couldn't challenge that conventional wisdom and thinking.
In general, Israeli society suffers from an inability, it's ironic in the Jewish society, right? But an inability to challenge quote unquote experts, right? People say, why should I have an opinion on the judicial reform? I'm not a, constitutional lawyer. What gives me the right? And one of the things I learned in government, and it didn't matter if it was in it was military issue. I never, for better and for worse, I never looked at the most prominent generals in the army, if there was a security cabinet, and thought to myself, wow, this person's opinion is better than mine or is more important than mine. Now, on tactical issues,
he'll know better.
They're the best.
Right.
They're the best, right? And I would never tell a general, hey, this is how you should conquer this hill by going through the north or through the south, or go in and save these hostages by quacking through this door versus that door. That you have to know your place. But strategically, what the right thing is, the north, the south, I realized very quickly that their opinion was no better than mine. And the same is true, by the way, on economic things, right? You don't need a PhD in economics to have an opinion on how to address cost of living. And I think a lot of times in Israel, there's this sort of deference to quote unquote experts.
But do you agree with me that that's been shattered a bit since October 7th?
Yeah, I think after this was the biggest intelligence blunder in the world.
Yeah.
In 100 years, maybe Pearl Harbor was worse, and I'm not even sure. Probably could have changed the world order more, but it's very, very hard to look at these people that got us into this mess and say, you're the people that are going to take us out of it.
No, 100%.
I think most Israelis get it. Now, Netanyahu's personality is so overwhelming that the country's going to be divided as long as he's around. But the general sense of where the population is and where the citizens are I think it's a better place than it was, when people were deferring to the experts for everything.
So let me by the way, I wrote this piece a few months ago where I felt like I did my own al-Khait, like pounding my heart in sin, because I felt that Israeli media, which I've been part of for a long time, was complicit also in not properly challenging and not asking those questions.
Israeli media is horrible on that front. And by the way, it's not just the military correspondents
they're mouthpieces of the army.
The health ministry during the COVID, we were mouthpieces. The health journalists were mouthpieces for the health ministry. The economic reporters are mouthpieces for the finance ministry. It's horrific. There's no real independent journalism the way you see it. The Daily Wire or the Free Press. All of a sudden, you see people. There's a thirst in the world for independent journalists that actually say the truth. But Israeli media,
we don't have that here.
Access to the municipal spokesman,
especially when it comes to security.
So
especially when it comes to security issues.
I'll give you an example. This is really hammers it home. So one time, when I was Director General and Bogi Ya'alon was Defense Minister, so we were sitting together.
He's gone off the deep end.
But if this is back when he was highly regarded, and so he was very frustrated over the budget negotiations because he said to me, Ellie, here's the issue. Our reporters, the finance ministry's journalists, they keep hammering home about how we're a bunch of, we were greedy and we pensions and budgets, etc. They talk about it all the time. And my journalists don't care about these stuff. They care about defense issues and whatnot. And they don't really focus on the budget. Just the way he framed it, the finance ministry's journalists and my journalists, right? That tells you it was a subconscious dig. He didn't even realize how insulting he was to like true professional journalists, but the way he was so dismissive of them, it struck me. And I remember that very, very vividly. The journalists, they really, really view themselves in Israel as mouthpieces for the people they're covering.
I'm laughing because I was military reporter for a long time.
You weren't like that.
No. I take responsibility. I was, because every year they would take us, and we tried to ask questions, but every year around the budget talks, we would get called in for a briefing with the chief of staff. And it was like doomsday. The world is coming to an end. We're all going to die. If only we get money to be able to buy what we need and everything will be okay. And we just parroted what they told us.
Can I use an analogy from a completely different world, which made a very big impression on me when I was a child? So I'm a big fan of sports, baseball analytics. I remember, the godfather of baseball statistical analysis was a gentleman named Bill James. And he would write these abstracts in the early 80s. And he would talk about how the fact that he was an outsider was an advantage. He wasn't speaking to the managers. He wasn't speaking to the players. He wasn't speaking to the general managers. So he had the most objective view. And he could actually report things that were very novel and, over the next several decades, completely changed the way baseball is managed, coached, played, etc. But he viewed it as an advantage that he didn't speak to the players, right? And I would love to see journalists in Israel that don't feel that they are beholden to the local spokesman. I don't need to be the first. I don't want to hear, as a consumer of journalism, I don't want I don't care who's the first person to report something. I don't care about a scoop, right? I want someone who's independent and who can give me something insightful to say. And we're seeing that with, people don't go to the free press because they have a scoop. People go to the free press because they think, wow, this is really independent and wonderful journalism. And that's why I gravitated towards Bill James and couldn't care less about sort of the insider notes and what this player said and that player said. And that's really what we need. And I think eventually we'll get there.
So I want to shift gears for the last few minutes of the conversation and talk just a bit about Israel-U.S. relations, but also the war more generally. I mean, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, GHF, the way this has been managed, I mean, it totally makes sense to me, right? We should be giving out the humanitarian aid, bypassing Hamas, which is hijacking it and reselling it and self-sustaining itself and all that. So, first of all, why didn't we do this from day one? Number two is, once we're already doing it, why is it all so cloak and dagger? Why isn't it just clear this is Israel who's doing it? Because Israel has gone, this isn't your responsibility. But you see that things like this happen often on issues where it's never transparent, it's never clear. There's always another hidden agenda. And what people might say about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the reason it was done like this is because Bibi didn't want to upset Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and have them know that Israel is paying for and distributing humanitarian aid by a proxy, but it is actually Israel that's doing it. I mean, but in the end, it's the right thing.
So you're asking a lot of questions. I'll try to address them. So first of all, a lot of people changed their sort of mindset on October 7th, but some people didn't. And among those was the army, right? And the army was even though it was very clear from day one, and many people were speaking about the travesty that was the quote unquote humanitarian aid and how important it was for the Israelis to take control of it. I mean, how can you fight a war against Hamas and continue to support them by giving them access to all this sort of these resources that are required and they convert that into money, et cetera? And when people like Smotrich spoke out and said, we have to take responsibility for the humanitarian aid, the army pushed back. Military, Herzl Levy said, no way.
Right.
We're not going to do that out. He preferred to have Hamas take control of it and send soldiers in to fight Hamas and embolden Hamas. So that was a major, major mistake because they weren't willing to switch their mindset. I think everyone recognizes now that 19 months too late, doing it sort of the right way is what should have happened 19 months ago. And yes, that means, but the vision, like if you want to defend Herzl here, the vision of sort of these are paratroopers, these are Golani, these are tankists.
It's not their job.
It's not their job to give out, to function as a soup kitchen. He couldn't get his mind wrapped around that. But Smotrich was taking the strategic view of we need to control where this goes. It's not about, hey, he went and did 2 years of training and so that he can give out 3 meals a day. It's more about we need to control this. And the military leadership couldn't change their mindset. Netanyahu couldn't change his mindset. And it took 19 months. And by the way, that's why one of the reasons this war has dragged on far more than is acceptable is because the Israeli military leadership and government didn't change its mindset quickly enough. Ties back into the sort of the UN, the UNRWA sort of disengagement. The rest of the public was there. The Knesset members were there. But the government and the army were sort of the last ones to recognize, hey, we need to start imagining a world without...
But is it because it's hard for, let's say, Netanyahu, and you've seen him in a lot of different...
people to change.
It's hard for people to challenge, to change.
It's hard for people to change the status quo. And the claim that the military made was, what, the armies, the soldiers are going to serve as a soup kitchen, right? That's it. And the answer isn't yes. The answer is we're going to do what it takes to take responsibility for this humanitarian aid and make sure it goes to the right people and doesn't go to strengthen Hamas. People, when they view things very, very tactically and not big picture strategically, it's hard for people to change their mind. And I have to say that one of the biggest failings in Israeli public service, both in the government and the military, is a lack of sort of strategic view on where are we going. By the way, even right now, if you look at Yair Golan, he has a view on what the end game is in Gaza.
Right.
If you speak to Smotrich, he has a view on what the end game is in Gaza. Right? Smotrich is aligned with President Trump. Yair Golan has a different view, but they have an end game in mind. If you ask, Netanyahu what the end game is in Gaza, who runs it? Who controls it? There's
well, so far it's this militia.
Exactly. So the strategy is arming militias, right? Because there's no, the thought process there is, hey, let's kick the can down the road and maybe the answer will become obvious, a month from now, 6 months from now, 2 years from now. Anytime you sort of make a decision, you're going to upset some people. And so that's why Netanyahu has pushed off making decisions.
So on the Israel-U.S. angle, because you spent some time there as the economic attaché for Israel, so you were there for a number of years, but also as Director General of the Prime Minister's office, you were there in the twilight days of Barack Obama and the beginnings of the first couple of years of the Trump administration, which were very, very, very different between.
I was attaché and Director General from 2011 to 2018. So you got
a lot of Obama,
a lot of Obama, and a lot of Trump,
and a lot of Trump. I mean, those are two very distinctly different administrations in their approach to Israel and our relations with them, right? The 2015, when you came in as Director General, was just after the infamous speech at Congress that Netanyahu gave in spite of the president himself. Then comes Trump, and everything seems like it's changing, and he did a lot of amazing things for the state of Israel, and everything did change. Comes Trump now, after Biden, and everyone thinks it's going to be amazing. It's going to be carte blanche. It's almost the Messiah has arrived, and it's not exactly like that, right? We see what he's done on the Houthis. We see what he's doing with Ashara, the Syrian president. We see what's happening with talks with Iran. We see the direct negotiations. America, for the first time, is speaking directly with Hamas. How do you understand what's happening there? And did we misread the Trump administration this time?
I think he's acting on brand and in line with expectations of sort of Trump 2.0 and the whole sort of MAGA movement. But I think it's important to take a step back and understand something that I can't emphasize enough. The U.S.-Israel relationship is as complex as it is deep. And that's a good thing, Yaakov. This is not a relationship that depends on personal chemistry between the prime minister and the president. It's institutionalized across multiple layers. There's military to military, there's intelligence to intelligence, there's innovation ecosystems, there's scientific cooperation. And these channels continue to function with a great deal of trust, even during periods of political tension. Now, we have to acknowledge, right, this is a period of increased friction. It's driven by Israel's inability to win this war decisively quickly. And my impression from afar of President Trump is he wants to achieve as much as possible as quickly as possible. He's got this 2-year window where he controls the executive branch, House.
Before the midterms.
Right, before the midterms. And historically, midterms are always, good presidents, bad presidents, typically they always go against. It's a reactionary. And I think most people probably expect that they won't control Congress after the midterms, right? I think that's a fair bet. So now is his window.
Yes.
And that's the timeline Trump is working on. And you have to understand, Trump was told by people very close to him, doesn't matter if it's true or not, but he was told that, the reason Israel isn't winning this war decisively is Biden.
Right.
Biden's fault. He heard that so many times and he believed that. And you saw immediately after he was elected, he said, the gates of hell are going to come. And after he went in, and that was, again, this was 7 months ago. After he went into office, he immediately sort of all the ammunition that was being held up, he released it, etc. And he really believed that, Israel, which over the last 10 years has probably invested close to $1 trillion shekels in defense. And you compare that to Hamas, which, even with all the USAID money and the Netanyahu money, with all that, maybe it's at 1% of that. Like it's impossible to conceive that if you really decide you're going to win, you're not going to win. And he sees that this thing is dragging on and on and on.
So he's disenchanted.
And I think he doesn't understand, why is Israel not winning this war? Now, he's working on his American timeline. He wants to get as much done as possible. And that's why you saw sort of what happened in the region. Netanyahu, this is very bad for Israel, was sidelined.
Right.
He's really sidelined because Trump's not waiting around. So this is not an
So he's moving ahead with his U.S. interest, and right? We're paying the price at the moment.
We are in a situation where we're sort of missing the train. The train is going forward. It waited for us a little bit, but he's not going to wait for us for years.
Can we still get on the train?
Yeah, but we need to end the war in Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
We need to end the war in Gaza. And yeah, we can get on the train, no question. But we're not, from Trump's perspective, end the war, win the war. He's not saying end the war, he's saying win the war.
Right.
End it, win it. And the Israelis haven't done that. And I think that's sort of the source of a lot of, to the extent that there is tension between the leadership, that's the source.
So I want to ask you one
By
last
the way, Netanyahu will tell you, no, active draft Milunikim and reservists, it takes time. And there's hostages, by the way. We can't just go out and win a war and sacrifice. There's reasons why Israel is going about this much slower than I think we should have. But Trump is not going to sit around and wait for us.
Yeah. I mean, by the way, there's a whole other conversation about the war is like, what is the definition of victory and what is the military victory? Because let's just say we don't know that we've.
Well, Israel defined.
No, I know what it defined: the elimination of Hamas and the return of the hostages.
All the hostages.
But let's assume you can.
No one forced that on the Israeli government. That's what the Israelis chose.
100%. But let's say the elimination of Hamas. What is exactly? Is that 70% of Hamas destroyed, or 80%, or 90%, or because there is no 100%? Right. No. But maybe we're there already. We just don't even know that we're there.
If we were there already, then our hostages would be home.
If it's exactly correlated one to the other. I'm not sure. I don't know. But that's not what I wanted to ask you. I wanted to ask you because as you're talking about, I'm remembering that you were there in the Prime Minister's office when the last MOU was signed between Israel and the United States for the foreign military aid. $3.8 billion. Went into Barack Obama signed it in the end of his term. And gave Israel $38 billion over the span of 10 years. That's coming up to an end in probably the end of 2027. And Israel has to decide today, or very soon, let's say, do we start negotiations with the Trump administration and do we try to get another MOU, or do we start to wean off the U.S. military aid? I'm curious if you have an opinion on that.
So my biggest aha moment. So like a lot of things about this war on October 7th, I don't want to sound presumptuous, it didn't surprise me. But there was one thing that did surprise me, and it probably shouldn't have in hindsight, because I was close to this on a number of fronts, but it did. And that is the extent to which we are dependent on the U.S. for our security needs. Right? And again, I was Director General of the Prime Minister's office, knew the budget very well.
Yeah.
What became clear was that we need, I don't want to say wean ourselves off the aid, but we need more independence, right? We need to be able to, if there was, God forbid, and I'm not calling, if there was an administration that was not supportive of Israel under this war, we would have been in very big trouble. And the next war,
that could happen.
Very big trouble. Right. Therefore, we need independence in terms of weapons manufacturing. We need independence on a lot of fronts, and we need it we need it in a way that we don't have it today. Now, does that mean weaning ourselves off the aid? Not necessarily. I think the aid is benefits the U.S. no less than it benefits Israel. Right? I'm sure of that. So I don't view maybe even aid is the wrong word, but I don't view the support, the investment that the U.S. gives in Israel for our qualitative edge, our qualitative military edge. I don't view that as good for us and bad for the Americans. I view that as a win-win. So anytime you have a win-win, I would like to see it keep going, but we do need to get more independence.
Okay, Eli Groner, thank you so much for joining me. It's always great to hear from you, get your insight, and have you here at JPPI with us.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
And that's another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. You can find us, as always, where podcasts can be found: Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and the website of Times of Israel. And we